Hello, everybody. My name is Sharrona Pearl, and I want to start by thanking Dr. Anthea Butler and Dr. Kevin Gannon for organizing the scholar strike. I'd like to extend my appreciation and sincerest gratitude to everybody who's participating in whatever way is possible for them, either through teach-ins such as this, through away messages, through taking advantage of the wonderful tools that have been made available through the labor of Doctors Gannon and Butler, for everybody who's put up an away message, everybody who is educating their students and using this opportunity to help them become more educated about these issues. So thank you so much for participating, and thank you so much for listening to me today. I want to talk to you a little bit about a project that I did, and it was really a labor of love. Essentially, I was watching the news, as so many of us were, starting from around 2014, 2015, 2016, as the news began to cover the police shootings of particularly Black men and women in the US. And I was really struck by a strange phenomenon that I'm sure many of you noticed as well, which is that immediately following the murder of a son, a daughter, a loved one, mothers, lovers were asked on television news whether or not they forgave the perpetrators who shot their family members and other loved ones. And it was just such a grotesque question. What a strange thing to do. There's no other context in which somebody has a violent, horrific act done to them and their family, and we ask, well, do you forgive the person who does it? And like others, I decided to start to unpack what was actually going on with that very question. Who were we being asked? Who were these women being asked to forgive? And what labor were they being asked to do? Of course, I was far from the only one to ask these questions, and there was some wonderful work being published at the time. Brittany Danielle wrote a piece saying, "Stop asking Black people to forgive their children's killers." Chauncey DeVega wrote this piece originally in Alternate. It was later republished in Salon, saying, "Black America owes no forgiveness, how Christianity hinders racial justice." And that was building on these narratives of a kind of notion that there has to be this salvation done, this forgiveness done. But again, the question was so grotesque. And I decided to think a little bit more about it. And I know we're really focusing on practical tools here, so I really will get into that. But first, I really just wanted to lay out the question and hear from the people themselves who had these acts perpetrated against them. So I thought a little bit about forgiveness and noticed that there is a real disproportionate way that forgiveness was being asked, mostly of people of color and women, particularly Black women. And what forgiveness does, in a way, is it removes your right to vengeance, anger, and retribution. When you forgive someone, you're saying, okay, let's get back to normal now. So all those things that are coming to me because of this wrong that was perpetrated against me, against my family, against my body, against my property, I'm saying we're good to go now. And that's what this request really is about. It's saying, I absolve the police of their responsibility in this violent murder. And in fact, I want to restore the social status quo, building on Victor Turner's notions about social dramas. So what the forgiveness does is it restores social status quo, and the dominating power maintains or regains moral authority. So this was something that I and other people were noticing, but wasn't really happening, right? Does this kind of ritual of putting somebody on television and saying, do you forgive the cop who shot your son? Is that something that was happening in one or two cases or a repeated phenomenon? And it turns out that it was quite a repeated phenomenon that we saw over and over again. So I honed in on a couple of specific case studies. Eric Garner's murder in 2014, Michael Brown's murder in 2014, Tamir Rice's murder in 2014. And of course, these were the cases that galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement from a hashtag to the streets. You'll be familiar with all of these. Samuel DuBose in 2015, Philando Castile in 2016. And I do want to note that there were many female victims, including Rekia Boyd, Sandra Bland, Charlena Lyles. They weren't captured in this particular data. Of course, Breonna Taylor now, and many others. But I want to not contribute to female invisibility and acknowledge them, and following Kimberly Crenshaw's initiative just to say their names as well, of these women who were also murdered by the police. And of course, we can add so many more today. So just turning to the voices themselves, when these women were asked on national television in a very traditional public sphere, do they forgive the police officers who killed their families? Let's hear what they had to say. And I want to pause and say one of the things that's really important about this approach is that there's such wonderful work out there about Black women's resistance and organizing in the countersphere. I think in particular of work like that of Sarah P. Jackson's and Armin Towns, the work on anger by by Brittany Cooper, work on Black women's anger, building on classic work by Audre Lorde. And we've seen a lot about how anger itself can be an act of resistance, and that's incredibly important. With all the attention that's being paid to the countersphere, I was interested in how in the traditional public sphere, when somebody is on the most classic of public sphere spaces, the most classic of medias, television, news, and press conferences, is there a space for resistance when Black women, as they often are disproportionately asked to perform public labor, emotional labor, and salvation for the crises of America today? So Asa Gardner in 2014, when she was asked, do you forgive the police officer who murdered your child? She says, hell no. Your husband, I'm sorry. The officer did not apologize, but he expressed condolences, which is a classic sorry, not sorry. It's an attempt to punt responsibility to offer some sort of panacea without actually offering any kind of apology, thereby eliding any kind of responsibility at all, but still gaining the effectiveness of forgiveness, still gaining the ability to have somebody absolve their right to retribution and anger. Garner said, the time for remorse would have been when my husband was screaming to breathe. Leslie McSpadden in 2014, who was the mother of Michael Brown, answered the question, do you forgive the police officer, with never. He won't even admit what he, Darren Wilson, the police officer, did was wrong. And Wilson said in his own words that he had a clean conscience, but of course he was sorry that their son lost his life. Samaria Rice in 2015 said, I have not yet received an apology from the police department or the city of Cleveland in regards to the killing of my son. She wanted an apology, but she did not commit to forgiveness. So once again, there's a significant form of resistance here. Audrey DuBose in 2015 said, if he asks for forgiveness, oh yeah, I can forgive him. I can forgive anybody because God forgave us. And that's the only example of forgiveness that I saw in any of the case studies that I explored. And it's predicated on, once again, that particular Christian narrative. But it's still contingent on an apology, which was not then nor has ever been offered. And Valerie Castile in 2016 said, he took my son's life. I can't forget that, and I don't forgive him. Bottom line. So here we see this really powerful mode of resistance, using anger and maintaining anger as a way to insist on your right to retribution, to insist on the necessity of consequences here. We saw zero apologies, many sorry, not sorry sentiments, and apologies in this case can't be offered because the moral authority of the state and the law cannot be compromised. So we see this in all of these discourses about the police today, which is so much of what this strike is predicated upon. The idea that the police have to maintain power because our safety very much depends on it. And think about who R is, of course, in that context. There are many people whose safety is very much compromised by these people being in power. And this whole narrative of bad apples, as Rashawn Ray and others have pointed out. If the whole foundation is rotten, removing specific people isn't going to do any good. But that's what we're seeing here in the kinds of things I'm looking at as well. Specific apologies are not offered because that might actually indicate that wrong was done. Or specific people, those bad apples, might be offered as a way to save the foundation. But staying angry as these women do in really tricky conditions, when you're in public, in this sphere, when everybody's looking at you, is an act of resistance toward this narrative. It is insisting that this is not just a case of needing to maintain law and order and the status quo. Something is wrong here. Forgiveness and absence of apology would serve to exonerate and excuse whiteness and structural oppression without even admitting that it's present. It's kind of a nifty trick, actually, and a chilling one. Christianity provides a framework for offering forgiveness, but again, only in the presence of apology and repentance. And here there is neither apology nor repentance. So what we see in all of these cases is no money shot. Families worked hard to seem composed and control, clear, and effective. And that's a really important piece of this too, because even as this anger, this labor of anger, which is a form of resistance, is being performed by these women on television, they understand that the Black body in the US is always assumed to be dangerous. It's always assumed to be angry. It's always in the wrong place. So there has to be this extra disciplining of seeming reasonable, of seeming in control. But it's important to see and emphasize that families subvert the narrative of the angry Black man and woman while still insisting on the right to retribution, justice, and vengeance. There's a resistance through anger in the public sphere, and it's a strategy that rejects forgiveness and maintains the moral upper hand, placing the onus on the perpetrator to search for the moral crisis, not on an individual level, but more broadly. These are not just a few bad apples, okay? The entire system is rotten. And it requires an additional layer of behavioral discipline. It's part of the disciplining of the Black bodies in the U.S. and an additional burden on Black families to resist the money shot. But these women resist pressure in the U.S. of forcing Black women to do public emotional labor and, in fact, to save us, as we have seen again and again and again. This narrative that Black women will save us from our own, as a white woman, of our own misdeeds, our own poor voting, our own problematic records, our own white feminism. And that is an unfair expectation, and staying angry is a form of resistance to that. Now, in my work, I see that over time, explicit requests for forgiveness decline. As the narrative shifts to exploring patterns of racialized shootings, anger becomes justified, as long as it's expressed in a reasonable way. So that piece of reasonableness is yet another example of the unfair distribution of emotional labor. Demeanor becomes the new mediating force for judgment, and the system and individual officers are increasingly implicated, but they are still being exonerated in the courts of law. And even in this moment, while we are shifting our attention and perhaps having the possibility of changing things, there's still a lot of resistance from this idea of the necessity of protecting law and order and protecting the system itself. Now, a bit of practical guidance, which I think is probably quite obvious. Don't ask mourners to forgive perpetrators. Don't use the narrative of apology to coerce emotional labor. And most importantly, and this is why we're here, hold perpetrators accountable. Apologies or non-apologies do not serve as consequences. When the system is rotten, eliminating a few bad apples doesn't cause the tree to stop breaking. It's an ongoing crisis, as we know, but it is not the job of Black women to suture the crisis. It is not the job of Black women to entertain the masses through the performance of forgiveness. It is not the job of Black women to forgive, especially with an apology, but especially without an apology, but even with one. Once again, thank you so much. This work is covered in a paper, so if you're interested, you can get in touch with me to talk about it further. But really, once again, thank you to Dr. Anthea Butler, Dr. Kevin Gannon, and everybody here who is participating. And this is just the beginning of the labor for us, and may it continue. Thank you.